They called her Ox Girl, 16 years old, built solid like the barn doors back home, and about as wanted. Her own stepfather, a man named Rufus with whiskey-sour breath and knuckles like riverstones, sold her. Traded her away like a side of beef for a pouch of coins and two hand-carved knives. He handed her over to a man who walked out of the heat haze like a ghost. An Apache man named Kolo, with eyes that didn't blink and a silence so deep it could swallow a scream. Mercy thought her life was over. She thought this was the end of the line, out here in the dust-choked town of Blue Mesa, where the world felt like it was fraying at the edges. But she was wrong. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. And the man who bought her wasn't a monster. He was something else entirely. What happened on that lonely mountain, in the heart of the unforgiving wild, is a story you won't soon forget. It's a story about what happens when two broken people, thrown away by the world, find out they're exactly what the other one needs to become, whole. And it starts right now. The town of Blue Mesa was more of an argument than a settlement. A single dirt road, two saloons staring each other down, and a general store that smelled like regret and bacon grease. Mercy sat on the back of the mule cart, her feet dangling, the rough wood digging into her legs. The dress she wore was too tight in the shoulders and too loose everywhere else, a hand-me-down from a woman who had died of fever. Beside the cart, Rufus Harper leaned against the wall, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. He hadn't said a word to her all morning, just loaded her up like a sack of flour and hauled her into town. Mercy knew the signs, the way he cleaned his boots, the way he combed his greasy hair with water. It meant a deal was being made, and she was the price. Then she saw him, a figure walking down the center of the road. No horse, no wagon, just the slow, steady rhythm of a man who owned the ground he walked on. He wore buckskin, and his hair was in a long black braid that hung down his back. As he got closer, Mercy saw the lines on his face, carved by sun and wind, and things she couldn't imagine. "That's him," Rufus muttered, shoving himself off the wall. The man stopped a few feet away. He didn't look at Rufus. He looked at the sky, at the heat shimmering off the rooftops, at anything but the man who was about to sell him a human being. "I'm Kolo," he said. His voice was low, like rocks grinding together deep underground. Rufus spat. "You the Apache?" Kolo didn't answer. His silence was an answer all its own. Rufus jerked a thumb toward Mercy. "That's the girl, strong as she looks. Can cook, carry, patch a wound. Don't talk much." Mercy felt her face burn hot with shame. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the cracks of the wagon boards. Kolo's eyes finally landed on her. It wasn't a cruel look. It wasn't a hungry look. It was just a look. Like he was seeing the whole story of her in one glance. Then he knelt and placed a bundle on the ground. Inside was a pair of beautiful knives with carved handles, a leather pouch heavy with coins, and a silver pendant shaped like a hawk. "This is what we agreed," Kolo said. Rufus grunted, his greedy eyes fixed on the bundle. He scooped it up, checking the weight of the coin pouch. "A bit light," he grumbled, his eyes narrowing. "For a girl her size, I figured—" He stopped, because Kolo had moved. It wasn't fast, but it was sudden. One moment he was standing there. The next his hand was on the handle of the knife at his belt. He didn't draw it. He just rested his hand there. "The price was agreed," Kolo said. And this time his voice wasn't like rocks. It was like ice. "Do you want to change the terms?" Rufus swallowed hard. He looked from the knife to Kolo's unblinking eyes and back again. A flicker of fear, real and raw, crossed his face. He shook his head, clutching the bundle to his chest. "No, no, the deal is the deal." Kolo didn't relax. He didn't move a muscle. He turned his head just slightly, and his eyes found Mercy again. "Do you want to come?" he asked. The question hit her like a physical blow. No one had asked her what she wanted in her entire life. She looked from this terrifying, silent stranger to her stepfather, the man who used a belt for more than holding up his pants. She thought of the cold cabin, the stale bread, the endless, aching loneliness. She gave a single tiny nod. "That's that," Rufus said, already backing away. "She's yours now. Don't bring her back." Kolo didn't watch him go. He just turned and started walking, away from the town, toward the high, lonely cliffs that clawed at the sky. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He just knew she would. And as Mercy slid off the cart, her worn-out boots hitting the dust, she took her first step away from the only life she'd ever known. She had no idea where she was going. She had no idea who this man was. All she knew was that for the first time, she was walking away from her cage. She just didn't know if she was walking into another one. The trail was a brutal, winding scar up the side of the mountain. The sun beat down, and within an hour, Mercy's legs were burning, her lungs screaming for air. Kolo didn't slow down. He moved with a relentless, ground-eating pace, as if the mountain itself were pulling him forward. He didn't speak. He didn't look back. The silence between them was vast and empty, filled only by the crunch of their boots on loose rock and the rasp of Mercy's breathing. She started to wonder if this was a test, if he was going to walk her into the wilderness until she collapsed, then leave her for the vultures. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper of warning. By late afternoon, the world had turned into a maze of red rock canyons and twisted, skeletal trees. A storm was building on the horizon. The clouds bruised purple and black. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl that vibrated through the soles of her feet. Still, they climbed. Just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall, they reached a hidden plateau. Tucked against the base of a towering cliff face was a small adobe house, looking like it had grown right out of the earth. A single goat bleated from a rough-looking pen, and a few chickens scattered as they approached. The air smelled of cedar smoke, damp earth, and something wild she couldn't name. The inside was one room, spare but clean. A hearth against one wall, a simple table with two chairs, and a bed frame in the corner with a pile of furs. By the dying fire, a single sleeping mat was laid out. Kolo pointed to the mat. "Yours!" Mercy stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She finally found her voice, though it came out as a ragged crack. You're not going to touch me." It wasn't a question. It was a plea. Kolo looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. He gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. "No." Mercy swallowed, the relief so sharp it almost made her dizzy. "Then why?" she whispered. "Why did you take me?" He didn't answer. He just stirred the embers in the hearth, adding a few pieces of kindling until a small flame licked to life. "Storm's coming," he said, his back to her. "You can sleep dry. Work tomorrow." That was it. He handed her a wooden bowl filled with a hot, savory stew of beans and meat. Then he did something she never expected. He picked up a thin blanket, walked to the door, and stepped outside into the howling wind and driving rain, pulling the door shut behind him. He was sleeping outside, in the storm. Mercy stood frozen, the warm bowl in her hands. She had been bought and sold. She had been led into the middle of nowhere by a man who could have done anything he wanted to her. And he had chosen to sleep in the rain so she could have the shelter of his fire. She ate the stew, each bite a discovery. She had never tasted anything so good. Curled up on the mat, wrapped in a thick wool blanket that smelled of smoke and cedar, she listened to the storm rage outside. The thunder was a wild drum beat, and the rain lashed against the roof. She was stiff, alert, waiting for the door to open, for his shadow to fall over her. But the only sounds were the wind and the rain, and the steady, quiet crackle of the fire. No footsteps, no hand in the dark. For the first time since her mother had died, Mercy Harper didn't cry herself to sleep. She lay in the dark, in a stranger's hut, a traded girl in the middle of a tempest, and for the first time in her life she felt safe. But as the storm quieted and sleep finally began to pull her under, a new sound cut through the night. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. It was a scream, a low guttural sound of a struggle, followed by a snarling shriek that wasn't human. Mercy sat bolt upright, her heart seizing in her chest. Something was outside, and Kolo was out there with it. Her first instinct was to hide, to pull the blanket over her head and pretend she heard nothing. That's what the old Mercy would have done. The girl in Blue Mesa would have prayed for it to be over, for the monster in the dark to just go away. But something had shifted inside her. Maybe it was the warm food, or the simple, unexpected kindness of being given the fire. She crept to the single shuttered window and peered through a crack in the wood. The rain had eased to a drizzle, and the moon broke through the clouds in a pale, watery wash. And what she saw made the air freeze in her lungs. Not 20 yards from the door, Kolo was locked in a life-or-death battle. A massive mountain lion, sleek and powerful, was on him. Its claws were buried in his shoulder, its teeth bared in a terrifying snarl. But Kolo wasn't screaming. He was fighting back with a cold, silent fury. He had his knife in his hand, the same one he'd used to intimidate Rufus, and he was driving it into the cat's side again and again. It was a primal, horrifying dance of violence. The animal shrieked, a sound of pain and rage, and swiped at him, catching him across the chest. Kolo grunted, stumbling back, but he didn't fall. He lunged forward, putting his entire weight behind one final, desperate thrust of the knife. The cougar shuddered, a terrible tremor running through its body. It sagged, then collapsed onto the muddy ground, silent and still. Kolo stood over it for a long moment, his chest heaving. His buckskin shirt was shredded, and a dark stain was spreading across his shoulder and chest. He didn't even glance at the dead animal. He just turned, limping slightly, and walked back to the hut. Mercy scrambled back to her mat, her mind reeling. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, her body trembling, not sure what to do. The door creaked open. Kolo stepped inside, dripping water and blood onto the dirt floor. He didn't look at her. He moved to the hearth, his face a mask of pain. He tore off the ruined remnants of his shirt, revealing a series of deep, vicious gashes across his chest and a gaping wound on his shoulder. He grabbed a strip of cloth and a small clay pot from a shelf and began, with slow, methodical movements, to clean his own wounds. He never made a sound, not a whimper, not a curse, just the ragged sound of his own breathing. Mercy watched from the shadows, her throat tight with a feeling she couldn't name. He had fought a monster to protect this place, to protect his home, to protect her. She slid off the mat. The floor was cold beneath her bare feet. She walked over to him, her heart pounding. He didn't look up, just continued his work, his hands starting to shake from the pain or the cold. She reached out. Her hand hovered for a second, then she gently took the cloth from his grasp. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. They were dark, bottomless, and for the first time, she saw something in them beyond just stillness. She saw pain. She didn't say a word. She couldn't. She just took the pot of salve, dipped the cloth in it, and began to gently, carefully clean the edges of the wound on his shoulder. He flinched, a sharp intake of breath, but he didn't pull away. He let her. They stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the cloth against his skin. She worked with a focus she didn't know she possessed, her hands surprisingly steady. When she was done, she tore another strip of cloth and bandaged the wound as best she could, her fingers brushing against his hot skin. When she finished, she pulled back. He was still watching her, his dark eyes searching her face. "Thank you," he whispered. It was the first time he had spoken to her with anything resembling softness. Mercy just nodded, unable to speak. She retreated to her mat and lay down, her back to him. She heard him settle by the door, his form a dark shape guarding the entrance. Sleep didn't come for a long time. She lay there, listening to the sound of his breathing, thinking about the blood and the violence, and the quiet, stunning bravery of the man on the other side of the room. He was a stranger, a man her stepfather had called a savage. But tonight, he had bled to keep her safe, and as she finally drifted off, a terrifying thought surfaced in her mind. What kind of life had this man lived, where fighting a mountain lion in the dark was just another night? What other scars, deeper and more hidden, was he carrying? She was beginning to realize that the mountain lion wasn't the most dangerous thing on this ridge. The most dangerous thing was the man's past, and she had a feeling it was coming for them. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm. There were no more words of thanks, no more moments of shared vulnerability. Kolo's wounds began to heal, and the wall of silence between them went back up, thicker than before. Yet something had changed. The silence was no longer empty. It was watchful. He taught her without teaching. He would simply start a task, and she would learn by watching his hands. How to set a snare so perfectly it was nearly invisible. How to read the clouds to predict rain. How to find the tiny edible roots that grew beneath the sagebrush. He never praised her. He never corrected her. When she did something right, he would just give a single, almost imperceptible nod. For Mercy, who had only ever known insults and blows, that nod felt like a chorus of praise. She began to feel a change in herself. The mountain air, clean and sharp, was thinning out the fog of despair that had clouded her mind for years. The hard work was shaping her body. Her shoulders, once slumped in shame, were now strong from hauling water. Her hands, once soft and useless, were becoming calloused and capable. She still didn't speak much, but her silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of fear, it was the silence of observation. One afternoon, they were tracking a deer trail high up on the ridge. Kolo moved like a ghost through the trees, and Mercy followed, trying to place her feet as silently as he did. They came to a sudden clearing, and Kolo stopped dead. In the center of the clearing was an animal, a large gray wolf, its leg caught in the brutal steel jaws of a poacher's trap. The trap was old, rusted, illegal. The wolf was thin, its fur matted with blood and dirt. It snarled weakly as they approached, its yellow eyes filled with a desperate, defiant fire. Mercy expected Kolo to kill it, to put it out of its misery with a quick arrow or a merciful knife. It was the way of the wild. But Kolo did something else. He slowly knelt, his movements calm and non-threatening. He began to speak to the wolf, not in English, but in the low, rhythmic tones of his own language. It was a soft, chanting sound, like a prayer or a song. The wolf's snarling subsided, replaced by a low, fearful whine. Kolo reached into his pouch and pulled out a piece of dried meat. He tossed it near the wolf's head. The animal eyed it, then ignored it, its gaze fixed on Kolo. "She won't eat," Mercy whispered. "She's too scared." Kolo didn't look at her. "She's not scared," he said softly. "She's proud." He continued to speak to the wolf, his voice a steady, soothing hum. Then with painstaking slowness, he reached toward the trap. The wolf tensed, a growl rumbling in its chest, but it didn't lunge. Kolo's hands were steady as he worked the release mechanism. It was rusted shut, and he had to use the full force of his body to pry the steel jaws apart. There was a loud snap, and the wolf's leg was free. It was a mangled, bloody mess. The animal tried to stand, but collapsed with a pained yelp. Kolo tore a strip from his own shirt, the same one he'd used for his own wounds, and began to gently wrap the wolf's leg. The creature trembled, but allowed the touch. As Kolo worked, Mercy saw something she hadn't noticed before. A small, strange marking on the wolf's left ear, a tiny notch, almost perfectly triangular, clearly made by a knife long ago. Kolo finished his work and sat back on his heels. He looked at the wolf, his face filled with an emotion Mercy had never seen on him before. It was a profound, aching sadness. "You know her," Mercy stated, her voice barely a whisper. Kolo nodded, his eyes never leaving the animal. "Her name is Dust," he said, his voice thick. "She belonged to my brother." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. Brother. Kolo had never spoken of family. "Where is he?" Mercy asked, dreading the answer. Kolo finally looked away from the wolf, his gaze turning to the distant mountains, seeing something far beyond the horizon. "Dead," he said. The word was flat, final. "Killed by soldiers. They said he was a thief. They never found what he supposedly stole." He stood up, his movements stiff. "This trap was not set for a wolf," he said, his voice hardening, the ice returning. "It was set for me." Mercy's blood ran cold. The poacher's trap wasn't an accident. It was a message. Someone knew Kolo was here. Someone was hunting him. The wounded wolf, Dust, whined softly, as if she understood. She was a ghost from his past, a living reminder of a loss he carried every single day. And her appearance wasn't a coincidence. It was an omen. The past wasn't just coming for them, it was already here. They carried Dust back to the hut, a silent, three-being procession of the wounded. Kolo rigged a stretcher from branches and hide, and the wolf lay on it, surprisingly compliant, as if she understood they were her only hope. She didn't take her yellow eyes off Kolo the entire time. Back at the cabin, a new tense routine began. Kolo tended to the wolf's leg with a gentle precision that mesmerized Mercy. He crushed herbs into a paste, cleaned the wound daily, and talked to the animal in his low, quiet language. Dust, in turn, began to heal. She never acted like a pet. She was a wild thing, full of suspicion and pride. But a bond was forming between her and Kolo, a silent understanding that ran deeper than words. And slowly, she began to extend that trust, bit by bit, to Mercy. She would allow Mercy to bring her water and eventually a scrap of meat, which she would take only after Mercy had backed away. Mercy felt a strange kinship with the wolf, wounded, wary, learning to trust again. The presence of dust seemed to unlock something in Kolo. The wall of his silence began to develop cracks. One evening, as he sat sharpening arrowheads and Mercy stitched a patch onto her dress, he spoke without being prompted. "My brother's name was Tasa," he said, his voice soft. "He was a storyteller. He said words could build bridges or burn them down. He chose to build." Mercy kept her eyes on her needlework, sensing he needed to speak more than he needed her to respond. The soldiers at the Santa Fe outpost, they didn't like his stories. They said he was stirring up trouble. Captain Evans, their leader, he hated us. He saw us as less than human. Kolo's hands paused in their work. One day, Taza went to trade furs. He never came back. They said he stole a horse. They shot him in the back, left his body for the crows. He picked up the arrowhead again, his knuckles white. Dust was with him. She ran. I searched for her for months. I thought she was dead, too. He fell silent, and the weight of his grief filled the small room. Mercy finally looked up. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He just nodded. Taza used to say that silence is the heaviest stone. If you carry it too long, it will crush you. It was a confession, an explanation for the vast, quiet world he lived in. His silence wasn't a choice. It was a burden. A few days later, the real trouble arrived. It came in the form of a man on a horse, a stranger with pale, watery eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. He wore a long, stained coat, and the gun on his hip looked well used. He wasn't a soldier. He was something else. A bounty hunter. A man who smelled of cheap whiskey and desperation. He rode right into their clearing like he owned it. Kolo met him at the door, his body language deceptively relaxed, but Mercy could see the tension in his shoulders. Dust, who had been dozing in the sun, rose to her feet, a low growl vibrating in her chest. "Howdy," the stranger said, tipping his hat. "Looking for an Apache fella. Heard he lives up this way. Didn't figure he'd have company." His eyes slid over to Mercy, lingering for a moment too long. "You the girl they lost down in Prescott? Name of Mercy?" Mercy's heart hammered. How did he know her name? "No one lost me," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. The man's thin smile widened. "Maybe not, but there's a reward out for your return. Your stepfather, Rufus, he's telling everyone the savage Apache stole you away. The folks in town are getting riled up. Talk of a posse." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "And the soldiers from the outpost, they're interested too. Seems they have their own score to settle with the man of this house." He was connecting the dots. Rufus's lie about a kidnapping, the Army's old grudge. He was weaving a noose. Kolo stepped forward. "She stays," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Ain't my business," the stranger said with a shrug, holding his hands up in a gesture of false peace. "Just delivering the news. A man, an Apache man, living up here with a runaway white girl. That kind of story travels. And it draws flies." He looked past Kolo, his eyes landing on Dust. "And it looks like you already have ghosts coming back to haunt you." He spurred his horse, turning to leave. "Storm's coming," he called over his shoulder. "Best hope your roof holds." That night, the air in the hut was thick with unspoken fear. The stranger hadn't just been a messenger. He was a scout. He had confirmed their location. He had seen Mercy. He had seen Kolo. Kolo stood at the door for hours, staring out into the darkness. Mercy watched him, her stomach in knots. She finally broke the silence. "We have to run," she said. He turned, his face a mask of shadows. There is nowhere to run where they won't follow. He walked over to a loose stone in the hearth and pulled it free. From the hollow beneath, he took out a worn leather satchel. He placed it on the table. Before I came here, he said, I hunted a man. I hunted him for a year. I found him. He opened the satchel. Inside was a single object, a tarnished silver star, the kind a captain would wear on his uniform. It was Captain Evan's star. I didn't just let him die, Kolo whispered, his voice raw with a chilling intensity. I made him listen. I told him my brother's stories, all of them, and when I was done, I burned his bridge down. Mercy stared at the star, horrified and awestruck. This wasn't just a man who'd lost a brother. This was a man who had exacted a terrible, patient revenge. He hadn't just killed the captain, he had performed a ritual of justice. And now the captain's men, his whole world, were coming to collect the debt. She looked from the star to Kolo's face. She should have been afraid of him. This man was a killer, an executioner. But she wasn't. All she felt was a fierce, desperate need to protect him, because she finally understood. His silence wasn't a stone that would crush him. It was a shield, and it was about to break. The stranger's visit was like a stone tossed into a still pond, the ripples of his threat spreading out to touch every part of their lives. The easy silence they had built was gone, replaced by a taut, humming tension. Every snap of a twig, every call of a bird, sounded like an approaching rider. Kolo began preparing for war. He moved with a grim, focused purpose. He strung tripwires made of vine along the lower trails, hung with small, flattened tins that would rattle at the slightest touch. He sharpened every arrowhead he owned, his hands moving with deadly precision. He taught Mercy how to use a bow, not his large, powerful one, but a smaller one he carved for her from a willow branch. Aim for the chest, he told her, his voice devoid of emotion. Don't think. Just release. Her hands shook, and her first few arrows went wide, thudding uselessly into the dirt. But she kept practicing, hour after hour, until her fingers were raw and her shoulders ached. She wasn't just learning to shoot. She was learning to fight. For this patch of land. For this strange, quiet man. For herself. One night the wind shifted, carrying a scent that made Mercy's stomach clench. Smoke. Faint, but unmistakable. Kolo was on his feet in an instant, his eyes scanning the southern horizon. They're burning the valley, he said, his voice a low growl. Trying to flush us out. Do we run? Mercy asked, her heart pounding. No, he said, and his eyes had a hard, distant look in them. This is my home. This is where my brother is buried. I will not run again. That night, he did something she had never seen before. He stripped to the waist, and using a paste made of charcoal and grease, he began to paint his skin. Long, dark lines streaked across his chest and down his arms. They weren't random marks. They were symbols, ancient and potent, stories of war and spirits and grief. He was no longer just Kolo, the quiet man who tended his wounds in silence. He was becoming someone else, something older, the Ash, the ghost who had hunted a captain. He saw her watching, and he paused. This is the paint of my people, he said. It is a prayer that we will be remembered. He held out the small pot of paint to her. You are of this home now, he said. You have a right to its protection. Trembling, Mercy dipped her fingers into the cool, greasy paint. She didn't know the symbols or their meanings, so she drew the only thing she could think of. She drew a single, looping circle on the back of each of her hands, a circle with no beginning and no end, a symbol of a home that could not be broken. The attack came 2 days later, at dawn. The tinkling of the tin bells was their only warning. Mercy scrambled from her sleeping mat, her heart leaping into her throat. Kolo was already at the door, bow in hand. Dust stood beside him, hackles raised, a low, menacing growl rumbling in her chest. Stay inside, Kolo commanded, no matter what you hear. Mercy grabbed her own bow, her hands slick with sweat. I'm not hiding. A flicker of something, pride maybe, or fear for her, crossed his face. He gave a sharp nod. Stay low. She peered through the window. 2 riders were cautiously making their way up the trail. One wore the tattered blue of a cavalry uniform. The other was the tracker who had fled their last encounter, the one who knew the legend of the Ash. He looked terrified. Kolo Tanaya, the soldier shouted, his voice cracking with false bravado. You are wanted for the murder of Captain Evans. Come out with your hands raised. Kolo stepped out of the hut, a lone, painted figure against the rising sun. He looked like a spirit of vengeance. Evans was not murdered, Kolo called back, his voice ringing with startling power. He was judged. The soldier laughed nervously. We've got you surrounded, Apache. There's nowhere to run. It was a lie. There were only two of them. They were trying to scare him into surrendering. The soldier raised his rifle. Last chance. Kolo didn't move. Mercy's breath caught in her throat. She could see the soldier's finger tightening on the trigger, and then she saw it. A flicker of movement in the trees to the soldier's right. A third man, hiding in the shadows, taking careful aim at Kolo's unprotected back. It was the bounty hunter, the pale-eyed man with the dirty coat. He'd circled around. It was an ambush. There was no time to shout a warning, no time to think. Mercy lifted her bow. The world seemed to slow down. She remembered Kolo's words. Aim for the chest, don't think, just release. She pulled back the string, the motion suddenly feeling natural, practiced. She didn't aim at the soldier in the clearing. She aimed for the shadow in the trees. She let the arrow fly. There was a choked cry from the woods. The bounty hunter stumbled out from behind a tree, the arrow buried deep in his shoulder. He stared down at it in disbelief, then looked toward the hut, his eyes locking with Mercy's. His face was a mask of shock and rage. The soldier in the clearing spun around, confused by the cry. And that moment of distraction was all Kolo needed. His bow snapped. The arrow was a blur. It flew with impossible speed and accuracy, striking the soldier square in the chest. He dropped his rifle, a look of stunned surprise on his face, and crumpled to the ground. The young tracker stared at the body of the fallen soldier, then at the painted, silent figure of Kolo, and then at the impossible sight of the wounded bounty hunter. The legend was real. He turned his horse so fast it almost fell and fled back down the mountain, disappearing into the trees. The bounty hunter clutched his shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers. He gave Mercy one last look, a look filled with a promise of hatred and revenge. Then he, too, scrambled onto his horse and galloped away, a wounded animal retreating to its lair. Silence descended on the clearing. It was over. For now. Mercy lowered her bow, her entire body shaking. She had shot a man. She had saved Kolo's life. Kolo walked over to her, his face unreadable. He looked at the bow in her hands, then at her face. He reached out and gently touched the circle she had painted on her hand. The storyteller, Tassa. He was wrong, Kolo said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't decipher. Sometimes words aren't enough. He pulled her into an embrace, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. It wasn't a hug of passion. It was a hug of desperation, of survival. The embrace of two soldiers who had just made it through a battle, clinging to the only other person in the world who understood what they had just done. In that moment, standing in the aftermath of violence, surrounded by the smell of pine and blood, Mercy knew one thing for certain. This was her home, and she would burn the whole world down to protect it. They buried the young soldier near the spring, under a canopy of aspen trees, whose leaves trembled in the wind like 1,000 tiny golden bells. Kolo carved no name into the marker, just a single straight line. A life begun and a life ended. He said no prayer. The silence was his eulogy. Mercy watched, her hand still trembling from the memory of drawing her bow. The image of the arrow striking the bounty hunter's shoulder was burned into her mind. She hadn't killed him, but she had drawn blood. She had crossed a line she never knew existed. A part of the soft, scared girl from Blue Mesa was buried on this mountain too. The aftermath of the fight was a heavy quiet. The threat wasn't gone. It had just retreated. The wounded bounty hunter was a loose thread, a promise of future trouble. They both knew he would be back. Revenge was a patient hunter. That night they sat by the fire, the space between them charged with everything that had happened. The violence, the fear, the rescue. You saved my life, Kolo said, breaking the silence. He wasn't looking at her, but at the flames. You saved mine first, she replied softly. He finally turned to her, and his eyes were full of a raw, aching vulnerability. No one has ever fought for me before. No one has ever been worth fighting for, she said, and the truth of the words surprised her. He reached across the small space that separated them, and his fingers brushed against hers. It was a tentative, questioning touch. She didn't pull away. She intertwined her fingers with his. His hand was rough, calloused, but warm. So incredibly warm. They didn't sleep in their separate places that night. He laid his bedroll next to her mat, close enough that she could feel the heat from his body, close enough that she could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. They didn't touch, not beyond their linked hands, but it was an intimacy more profound than any she could have imagined. It was the intimacy of shared survival, of a bond forged in fire and blood. They knew they couldn't stay. The soldier's body would be found. The tracker would tell his story. The bounty hunter would heal and his hatred would fester. The mountain was no longer a sanctuary. It was a target. The next day a new visitor came. But this one was not an enemy. It was a boy, no more than 10 years old, with eyes too old for his face. He ran up the trail, breathless and terrified. He was from a small, peaceful Apache encampment a few valleys over, a place Kolo sometimes visited for trade. "They're coming," the boy gasped, clutching a stitch in his side. "A sheriff and a posse from the town. They have horses. One's got a star." The news hit Mercy like a physical blow. It wasn't the army this time. It was the law. Rufus's lies had finally borne their bitter fruit. Kolo's face hardened. He gave the boy a water skin. "Where did you pass them?" "At the base of the canyon. They'll be here by sundown." Kolo stood, his decision made in an instant. He turned to Mercy. "Pack what you can. Food, water, blankets. Take the goat trail east. Dust will go with you." He looked at the boy. "You show her the way." Mercy stared at him, her heart sinking. "What about you?" "I will lead them west," he said. "Buy you time." "No," she said, the word coming out sharp and fierce. "I'm not leaving you." "Mercy!" "No," she repeated, stepping toward him, her hands clenched into fists. "We fought together. We leave together. Or we stay together." He looked at her, at the unwavering defiance in her eyes, the strength that had bloomed in her like a wildflower in the desert. He saw not the traded girl, but a warrior, his warrior. A slow, sad smile touched his lips. "Together, then." They waited. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red, they saw them, 3 riders ascending the trail. A middle-aged man with a silver star on his coat, and 2 grim-faced deputies, their shotguns held at the ready. Mercy and Kolo stood in the yard side by side. Dust stood between them, a low growl in her throat. The little boy hid inside the hut, peeking through the window. The sheriff pulled his horse to a halt about 30 yards away. He had tired eyes, but they were steady. "You Mercy Harper?" he called out. She didn't answer. He sighed, a weary sound. "Listen, girl, we don't want any more trouble. We just need to talk to the man who killed that soldier." "He was protecting me," Mercy called back, her voice ringing clear in the evening air. "That boy had a family," the sheriff said. "He had orders. He had a future." "So do I," Mercy shot back, and her words silenced him. The sheriff looked from her to the painted, silent Apache beside her. "We'll wait until the sun is down," he declared. "If he comes out to talk, we'll listen. If not, we're coming in." They stood in a silent standoff as the sky bled from red to purple. The air was thick with tension. Mercy's hand instinctively went to the bow on her back, and then she heard it. A sound that did not belong. The soft thud of horse hooves, not from the trail below, but from the ridge above them. The sheriff and his deputies heard it too. They spun in their saddles, their shotguns snapping up. Out of the trees, 3 figures on horseback emerged. They were Apache, but they weren't painted for war. They carried no rifles. One was an old man, his face a beautiful roadmap of wrinkles. Another was a young woman with a long, flowing braid. And leading them was an old woman, her back ramrod straight, her expression one of immense dignity and power. Kolo's aunt, an elder. They rode into the clearing and stopped, positioning themselves between the sheriff and the hut. They didn't speak. They just watched. Their presence was a statement more powerful than any threat. This is our land. This is our family. You are not welcome here. The sheriff swore under his breath. This wasn't a simple arrest anymore. It was an incident. The old woman spoke, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the twilight. She spoke in her own language first, then switched to broken, heavily accented English. She didn't talk about Kolo. She talked about Captain Evans. She told the sheriff of the stolen blankets, the poisoned wells, the women who were taken and never returned. She spoke of Taza, the storyteller, murdered for a horse he never stole. She wasn't making a plea. She was giving testimony. She was laying the crimes of the army at the sheriff's feet. The sheriff listened, his face growing paler with every word. He looked at Kolo, not as a murderer, but as the consequence of a much larger crime. He looked at Mercy, standing defiant and strong. He looked at the three silent riders on the ridge. He was a lawman in a lawless situation. He knew this was a fight he couldn't win, a moral quagmire that would swallow him whole. He slowly, deliberately lowered his shotgun. "This ain't worth dying for," he said to his deputies. He turned his horse, and without another word, he and his men rode back down the mountain, disappearing into the darkness. They were safe. Kolo let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a decade. He turned to Mercy, his eyes shining in the dying light. "I would have gone with them," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "if it meant you would be safe." Mercy shook her head, a tear finally tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "I'm only safe where you are." He stepped toward her. He placed a hand on her cheek, his thumb gently wiping the tear away. He looked at her as if seeing her for the very first time, not as the broken girl he'd traded for, not as a burden to protect, but as his equal. The woman who had fought for him, the woman who had chosen to stay. "There is something wild in you, Mercy Harper," he whispered. She smiled through her tears. "And there is something quiet in you, Kolo Tenaya." He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of hunger or possession. It was a kiss of recognition, of homecoming, the quiet, desperate meeting of two broken halves that had, against all odds, finally found their way to being whole. That night, the fire in the hearth burned low, but the warmth inside the hut was a living thing. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The long years of silence had taught them a language that existed beyond words, in shared glances and quiet gestures. Dust lay curled at Mercy's feet, her tail thumping softly against the floor in her sleep. Kolo's people had gone as silently as they had come, melting back into the mountains after a shared meal of roasted rabbit and a promise to send word if the soldiers returned. Mercy watched Kolo as he worked a piece of leather, his hands strong and sure. "You never told me what your name means," she said, her voice soft in the quiet room. He didn't look up from his work. "In the language of my people, Tanai is the spirit who guards the deep canyons. A watcher, a protector. And Kolo," he paused, his hands stilling. He set the leather aside and looked into the fire. "Kolo," he said, "means ash." Mercy frowned slightly. "Ash? Ash is what is left after the fire has passed," he explained. "It cannot burn again." The words settled over her, a quiet, devastating summary of the man he was. A man who had survived a fire so immense it had burned away everything he was, leaving only this quiet, resilient core. He could not be hurt in the same way again. Later, she stepped outside. The night was brilliant. The stars scattered across the black velvet sky like diamond dust. The mountain ridge looked like the spine of some ancient, sleeping creature. She drew her shawl tight, the cool air crisp against her skin. She thought of the girl she had been, the scared, overweight child cowering on the back of a mule cart. It felt like a lifetime ago. She hadn't just survived. She had been reborn in the crucible of this wild place. The next morning they made a decision. It was a hard one, filled with the bitter taste of loss. But they both knew it was necessary. The mountain was no longer safe. The sheriff had backed down, but the army would not. The bounty hunter would not. Their home was a beacon, and it was drawing danger toward them. They packed what little they could carry: dried meat, blankets, the cook pot, Mercy's small bow, and Kolo's tools. Mercy went to the goat pen and untied the goat, leaving the gate open. She scattered the last of the chicken feed on the ground. She whispered a quiet thank you to the sturdy little house, to the warmth of its hearth, to the memory of safety it had given her. It felt like tearing a part of herself away. Kolo stood at the edge of the clearing, by the soldier's grave. He placed a single, smooth river stone on the mound of dirt, a final gesture, an ending. As they started down the eastern trail, the path Kolo had told her to take, Dust trotted alongside them, needing no leash, no command. She, too, seemed to understand that this chapter was over. Mercy looked back one last time at the adobe hut tucked against the cliff face, her home. She turned away and didn't look back again. They walked for weeks. They moved through high country, across sun-baked plateaus and down into lush, hidden valleys. They slept under the stars and followed the game trails, living off the land. The world was vast and empty and beautiful. During this long journey, something new grew between them. The desperate, clinging bond of survival began to soften, transforming into a quiet, steady partnership. He taught her the names of the stars, and she drew them in a small, battered notebook she'd kept hidden in her pack. He showed her how to listen to the language of the birds, and she, in turn, began to fill their quiet evenings with stories. Not the grand, sweeping tales of his brother, but small, simple observations about the color of the sky or the shape of a peculiar rock. She was finding her voice, and he was listening. One evening, camped by a stream, she was sketching in her notebook. She had filled it with drawings of birds, trees, the changing landscapes. There was one half-finished sketch of Kolo, but she could never get his eyes right. He noticed her hesitation. "What is wrong?" "I don't want to finish it," she said. "Why?" She looked up at him, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "Because once something is finished, it becomes a memory. And I don't want you to be a memory. I want you to be here." He reached out and closed the notebook gently. "Then draw something that is not yet finished," he said. So she did. She drew a picture of two sets of footprints, walking side by side, heading toward a rising sun. Finally, they came down from the high country into a wide, fertile valley watered by a slow-moving river. A small, peaceful settlement was nestled among cottonwood trees, a collection of modest farms and ranches. It was a quiet place, a place where people came to be forgotten. Kolo knew a man there, an old trapper named Elias who had lost an eye in a bear fight, but as he said, could still see the truth of a person better with one eye than most could with two. Elias listened to their story, his one good eye studying them both intently. He nodded slowly. "The world's got no shortage of ghosts," he said, packing tobacco into a pipe. "Some folks run from 'em, others learn to live alongside 'em." He pointed with his pipe stem to a gentle slope dotted with willow trees at the far end of his property. "That land is fallow. No one's worked it in years. You build on it, it's yours. No one will come looking for you out here. Folks in this valley, we mind our own." And so they began again. Their new home started as nothing more than a lean-to of mud and branches. But day by day it grew. They cut timber from the woods, hauled stone from the riverbed, and mixed mud and straw with their bare hands and feet. Mercy worked alongside Kolo, her body strong, her spirit tireless. She had never known the pride of building something with her own hands. Every log she placed, every stone she set, was a declaration. "I am here. I am building a life. I will not be moved." The house grew, small but sturdy, with a porch that faced the sunrise. They planted a garden, the seeds they'd bought in Blue Mesa so long ago, symbols of a life they never got to live, finally found purchase in the rich, dark earth of the valley. Spring came, and the valley exploded in a riot of green. Life was good. It was quiet. The ghosts of the past seemed to have finally lost their trail. But ghosts are patient. One hot afternoon, a rider appeared at the edge of their property. It wasn't the law. It wasn't the army. It was the bounty hunter. He was thinner, his face gaunt, and his left arm hung at a strange angle, a permanent reminder of Mercy's arrow. His pale eyes were filled with a cold, dead hatred that had festered for months. He had a new, bigger pistol strapped to his hip. He had hunted them down. Kolo was in the woods checking snares. Mercy was alone, weeding the garden. Dust rose from the porch, a warning growl already starting in her chest. The bounty hunter dismounted slowly, his eyes never leaving Mercy. "Ox girl," he sneered. "Look at you, playing house." Mercy's heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood her ground. She rose slowly from the dirt, her hands empty. "You're not welcome here," she said, her voice steady. "I didn't come to be welcome," he said, his hand straying toward his gun. "The soldier you helped him kill, he was my nephew, just a boy. You owe me a debt." He was going to kill her, right here, in the garden she had built with her own hands. But then, a voice called out from behind him. "Her debt is with me." Kolo stepped out from the trees. He held no bow, no knife. His hands were empty, open at his sides. He walked calmly into the space between Mercy and the bounty hunter. "This is between you and me," Kolo said. The bounty hunter laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "It is, but I think I'll start with her. Make you watch." He began to draw his pistol, and then something happened that no one expected. A small figure darted out of the house. It was one of the children they had taken in, a young orphan boy who had lost his family to fever, a boy who hadn't spoken a word in 6 months. He ran and stood defiantly beside Kolo, holding a large, heavy rock in his small hands. Then another child appeared, a teenage girl with a scar across her face, who had run away from a cruel master. She stood on Mercy's other side, holding a sharpened hoe like a spear. Elias, the one-eyed trapper, appeared from the side of the house, his old hunting rifle cradled in his arms. The bounty hunter froze, his hand hovering over his gun. He hadn't come for a fight with a community. He had come for 2 isolated fugitives. He had come for revenge on 2 people, but he was facing a family. He looked at the determined faces of the children, at the old trapper, at the woman who was no longer an ox girl but a protector, and at the silent Apache who was no longer just ash, but the center of this unlikely, unbreakable home. He saw that he couldn't just take Kolo's life. He would have to tear down this entire world they had built. And he knew in that moment that he couldn't. His hatred, as vast as it was no match for the simple, powerful truth of what they had created. He slowly lowered his hand. His face, for the first time, showed not hatred, but defeat. He got back on his horse, turned, and rode away. And this time, they knew he would not be back. The ghost had finally been laid to rest. Years passed. The house grew roots. The garden flourished. More lost children found their way to the small farm by the willow trees, and they were always welcome. Mercy and Kolo grew older. The gray in his hair spread from his temples. The lines around her eyes deepened from smiling. One evening, they sat on the porch, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance. A whole new generation of children slept soundly inside the house. Dust, old and gray-muzzled now, slept at their feet. Mercy leaned her head on Kolo's shoulder. "Do you ever think about that first night?" she asked softly. "In the storm?" He nodded. "I was so scared," she whispered. "And you were so quiet." He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "You were strong," he said. "Stronger than you knew." She smiled into the twilight. "I still don't know my own strength." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her calloused knuckles. "I do," he said. "I know it for both of us." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars came out. 2 broken people who had been traded away and thrown away, who had found each other in the wilderness. They hadn't just survived, they had built a sanctuary. Not just a home, but a place of healing, a testament to the fact that sometimes the family you choose is the one that truly saves you. They were not untouched by the fire of the world, but they were mended, stronger in the broken places, and they were whole. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world and allows me to keep finding and sharing powerful stories like this one. Let me know in the comments what you thought about Mercy's incredible journey. Thanks for listening.